Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at Safe Camp Audio on all social media. On today's episode, we're going to do the second of a few guest interviews over the course of this month that I'm nominally calling Rule-a-Palooza. I guess the first one was in June, now we're into July. We have discussed a few times on the show the fact that the Biden administration has been pretty active in terms of making new rules and regulations in the child welfare space over the past year. And I wanted listeners to hear from actual subject matter experts on all of these, as they all have the potential, not for sure, but some potential to have an impact on child welfare and family policy in general. So in these episodes, we're going to have, one expert each come on. There will be a little formulaic compared to our regular guest interviews, because what I'm trying to do is create these kind of 101 style segments where you can see the problem each rule proposes to tackle, how it's tackling it, how people are going to sort of gauge the success, and all of that. So today we are talking to Allison Green, Legal Director for the National Association of Counsel for Children, who helped us break down a new rule about the use of federal funds to help pay for legal counsel to support parents and youth involved in child welfare cases. So listeners of this podcast have heard us discuss with some frequency changes that were made in federal policy several years ago that got the tap kind of running for this sort of legal counsel support. And Allison helped us to explain how this new rule impacts and expands on that. So without further ado, here is the second Rule-a-Palooza of the summer, Allison Green, on the new rules around legal counsel for parents and children. All right, we are doing a series of guest interviews on all of the new Biden administration rules that have come out or might come out soon. And today we have Allison Green, Legal Director for the National Association of Counsel for Children, to help us break down a new rule focused on federal support for different kinds of legal counsel to parents and children involved with the child welfare system. So Allison, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Allison knows the rules. She's a listener, so she knows this is coming before we get into the weighty issue of legal counsel for kids and parents. She's going to have to give you guys a favorite. So here are the categories: TV show or movie, book, musical group, or sports team. You can pick more than one. You got to give us one. Allison, what do you got for the people?
Okay, I think I'll do musical group. And it's just because it's top of mind today, but I've always been a big fan of Lisa Loeb. And yesterday was the 30th anniversary of her hit single, Stay, which I didn't know until yesterday. She was the first artist to reach a Billboard #1 as an unsigned artist.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Truly, in my lifetime, one of the most at its height ubiquitous songs on the radio. Like, you could not turn a radio on and listen for an hour without that song coming on. So this rule, unlike the others that we've done, has a mercifully short title. It's just called Foster Care Legal Representation. All the other ones have really wonky names. So Allison's going to just help us walk through, in layman's terms, what exactly happened here. So we'll start with part one. What is the problem or set of problems that the rule seeks to solve, and what was the status quo beforehand?
Thanks, John. So to answer that question, I think we got to take a walk back in time a little bit,
Agreed.
back to 2018 and every year before that in American child welfare, when the U.S. Federal government did not invest in legal representation for children and parents. It did provide an investment in funding for agency attorneys, for child welfare agencies to be represented in court. These 4E agencies, as they're called 4E agencies because they're grantees. They receive Title 4E funds under the Social Security Act, could draw down matching funds to support the work of their agency attorneys, much like they would for their caseworkers and social workers and for the placements and training they do. So, what does that do on a systemic level, year after year, decade after decade, when only one party to the case has a consistent and reliable funding source that the other parties don't have? It creates, the imbalanced system that we see today, where one party is just able to recruit attorneys, to train those attorneys, to resource those attorneys with experts and what they need to litigate, and to retain those attorneys long term, and that creates an imbalanced legal system. So seeing that, and then also seeing a really growing body of research that shows, wait a second, not only is it kind of not fair, it kind of instinctually know it's unfair not to have equal resources. We want court to be a level playing field. Not only that, but research was showing that when children and parents have attorneys, that the outcomes were a lot better. So seeing that, the US Children's Bureau about 6 years ago decided to make a change. They changed the Child Welfare Policy Manual, which is a body of administrative guidance, to say, you know what, states, you can now draw down the same federal matching for child and parent representation in the same way you have in the past for agency representation. And since that time, we've seen uptake in this, which has been great. It's been a little difficult to track the uptake because there's a lag in the release of federal data. As you know, the most recent federal report we have is about 18 months old at this point. So we're eagerly awaiting a new release. But even that showed that over half of states had been utilizing this funding in some way. Not across the board necessarily, because states may report that they're utilizing it, but some have chosen to start with parent rep and delay on child rep, or vice versa. Others started with child rep and delay on parent. Some went statewide at the beginning. Others said, you know what, let's start with a pilot in a certain county or region. So what we know is that at that time, 18 months ago, over half of states and 3 tribes were participating. But anecdotally, we work with states every day, and many more, I think, over the last 18 months are drawing down. And I'm anticipating at least 3/4 of states have been utilizing this money, and that we'll see that in the next report.
Yeah, and I'll drop a link to some reporting we did, based on data we gathered directly from states, which kind of I think suggests what you say there is correct. It was more than half the states, and I think it was like up to 300 million in 2023. So certainly more than that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a problem that not everyone had equal representation because child welfare courts are civil rights courts. And foster care is really a marriage of disciplines. I think when the American public thinks about foster care, they think about social work, they think about clinical skills, but that's only half of the equation. It's the legal rights too. That policy change was announced in December 2018, kind of went into effect in January 2019. And since that time, there's been this uptake. What happened with this new rulemaking was 2 things. One, the US Children's Bureau went to codify what was already happening. They said, okay, we had made this change in the Child Welfare Policy Manual. Let's put it into federal regulation. And that's the first thing that happened. And then the second thing is they went to expand it in 3 ways, which we'll talk about. The codification is important because federal rules are they have a little bit more anchor and they're harder to undo. So hopefully this will give a sense of ease or confidence to states that previously might have had heartburn about doing this based on child welfare policy manual change alone. They said, oh, this was so easy to do. It could be easily undone by a future leader or administration. They wanted to feel sure they could do this and engage in these new agreements and not have a disallowance of money. So this is just another federal reaffirmation and vote of confidence. Go do this. This change is here to stay.
Yeah, so like before we get to the what actually changes in the rule, I want to make sure people understand what you just said because I think it's important. 2018, it really, when Alice is talking about this CWPM or the policy manual, this is like a Q&A that exists on the website of the Children's Bureau, and it used to basically just have a question that said, can you pay for lawyers through 4E? And it's, I'm kind of glazing here, but basically like it used to just basically like, yeah, for the agencies. And now it basically says yes for all 3. But to her point, it would be just as easy for somebody to go in and just say no again, or make clear no, only for agencies. So on just a very basic level, what this rule is doing is taking that permission that was put into the policy manual and actually making it something that would actually take a sort of proactive effort by another administration or whoever to undo it or change it. It would be a lot more difficult.
Exactly. In the same way that going through this rulemaking is difficult and involves periods of
Yeah,
notice and public comment and review, any change to undo it would require the same
right.
thing.
Right. Okay. So now we go on to kind of part two, which is to explain. And I think Allison set the table for the very basic level is what the policy manual change did, which was open up the tap for this money to flow. And as we discussed, there's strong evidence that states are using that. They're drawing down the money. Okay. So what are you mentioned three kind of ways in which it goes beyond just opening up that tap. Why don't you take listeners through what those three things are?
Sure. So the three items, and I'll go through each of them, are tribal legal representation, relative caregiver legal representation, and civil legal proceedings. Let's start with tribal legal representation. The new rule opens up this same federal funding for the legal representation of tribes seeking to intervene or participate in child welfare proceedings. So that's an important key point that they announced in this rulemaking, that it's intervene and participate. The tribe can intervene in a case under the Indian Child Welfare Act, but they are also eligible for this funding, even if they don't want to formally intervene, but do want to participate. Maybe
Mhm.
they want to show up to placement meetings to offer information about kin who's available. Maybe they want to come to tea meetings to offer information about cultural identity or social context and community resources. Both of those are eligible. And tribes can draw down the same eligibility 50% match at their penetration rate. There is a unique caveat for tribes and only tribes, is that they are permitted to use this funding for an attorney to represent them, but also for a non-attorney to represent them. And that's a very unique carve out based in our overarching federal goal of having deference to tribal sovereignty. Tribes did participate in the rulemaking and say, there are issues with identifying our attorney workforce who's adequately trained in this specialized area of law and who can represent us, and we want this flexibility. The federal government said, okay, so tribes can use this 50% match for either. No other party can. It is a unique exception only for tribal legal representation.
Which I think is
Additionally,
important. Sorry to interrupt you, Allison, but and I'm not going to put you on the spot to like comment on this one way or the other. But why that is significant, right? There are certainly with child representation, there are states that use non-lawyers to represent children and appear before the court, and so I'm sure that became something that they deliberated over with this rule.
exactly. There are still 13 states that do not provide an attorney to represent children in foster care court cases, and that type of representation is not eligible for this
Mhm.
funding.
Gotcha. Sorry, continue.
Yeah. And then also in this first kind of bucket of change, the federal government also added the words Indian custodian to their list of eligible client representation. They did that to mirror the language of ICWA and noted that under the federal law, custodian may have a different meaning than parent. So that's just another smaller change. But that's really the first big one, is
Yep.
opening this opportunity for tribes. The second change is for relative caregivers, or what we commonly called kinship, although the rule uses the term relative caregiver. Now, kinship caregivers who need legal representation may also receive it with this Title 4E 50% match. And as a reminder, for all of these, the legal services entity or the client themselves, you can't just go to the federal government and seek reimbursement. This is all done through a partnership with the Child Welfare Agency. So what this will require is legal services agencies to develop those memorandums of understanding and agreements. During the notice and public comment period, the feds received 122 comments, so a pretty modest amount of comment from the field compared to some of the other rules that were pending at the same time. And one of them was around this relative caregiver piece. There was some comments saying, okay, but when, who counts as a relative caregiver? Are all kin going to get legal representation from any moment they want to? And the federal government's response to that was essentially, we're going to defer to states on how to implement this. So that'll be something interesting to watch for. How and when do states decide to craft these agreements? States have different statutes about when kin might be able to intervene or have standing in a case. I expect states will look to their own state law to try to mirror that. But overall, this is another expansion that I think perfectly aligns with the overarching support we've seen for Children's Bureau generally for kinship placements, especially the federal licensing regulations that were finalized last year.
I welcome your thoughts on this, Allison. I think what will be really interesting with this, added offer of funds to support counsel for kin is whether we see some states start to use it at this point that, our reporting has sort of surfaced over the years where there's pretty significant confusion, which is early on in CPS involvement with a family, kin understanding the different paths they could go down, right? If I don't really want caseworkers coming with the regularity they might to a foster family, what does that mean for me? I'm not going to be able to, do this without some financial support. How would I go through that? And I think there's, we talked to Anna Beltran from Generations United about, the kinship rule that already got finalized and sort of what that does for the thing. But I do think that, that's a point where it seems obvious that, legal counsel could really play a role in making things kind of more clear, about these paths.
Absolutely. Legal counsel, really for everyone involved, the parents,
Sure.
children,
Yeah.
because at that stage, legal rights are implicated. And it can be really important to keep kids out of foster care and support families in creating those arrangements. But there also are legal complications, risks, and consequences at stake that everyone benefits when they fully understand. And the arrangements can be much more effective when everyone has what they need. Sometimes kin need, paperwork to enroll a kid in school or to take them to the doctor, or parents want a reasonable understanding of what they need to do to get their kid back or how long that plan might last for. Importantly, this is an expansion and it's a pretty significant one. There are some modest funds available for kinship now, arguably under the Kinship Navigator programs of Family First. Some of those programs can include legal services as part of their model. But as you know, John, there's been challenges to getting Kinship Navigator programs approved under the clearinghouse. They have to be adequately evaluated and studied. So that is another pathway to funding legal services at that investigation stage. This is a much broader pathway that will apply both at the investigation stage and after removal.
Right. Okay, so then one more, right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, one more. And the last one is really the biggest bucket, and it is an expansion of Title IV reimbursable funds for independent legal representation for related civil legal aid needs. The needs must be related to a child's case plan. So first, what does that mean? That the child has to have a case plan. That means they have to have some involvement with the child welfare agency. It does not mean they need to be removed. And in fact, the rule explicitly applies to candidates for foster care. We've seen that candidacy language come up again and again in different laws and policies, but there needs to be some involvement. So to folks who maybe hoped that this could be true primary prevention and go totally upstream before even a hotline call, this is not the solution. There does have to be an engagement with the 4E agency. There are other federal funds available that states should continue to look to build out that upstream funding. Things like LSC funds, STOP grants, there's plenty more. This applies, we have to think of legal services funding as a spectrum. This applies for candidates up through removal and beyond. The federal rule is clear that a simple hotline call is not enough to be a candidate. There has to be an engagement with the child welfare agency, with the agency making reasonable efforts to try to prevent the removal of that child. And then the reimbursable legal work has to be linked to that child's case plan. So we can all think of many examples that come up quite frequently for families. For families where intrafamily violence is a concern, getting some sort of civil protection order or restraining order might be just what's needed to have CPS feel like, okay, this child is safe to remain home. Housing is a major factor for many families. And so having an attorney come in to get housing conditions remediated if there's mold or infestation in a home, or to fight back against a potential eviction and stabilize housing for the family. Public benefits and their appeals. The list kind of goes on in terms of things attorneys can do to help keep families together and prevent family separation. Activities that can't be tethered to the child's case plan are probably not eligible. So, for example, if a parent has a custody dispute regarding an entirely different child in family court, that's probably not going to count. Even though it's the same parent, it's not the same child. The civil legal aid funding is not just for candidates, but it's also post removal. So many of those legal needs I named for parents continue to endure after removal, and they may need that same advocacy, maybe doing a public benefits appeal to get food stamps or TANA funding in place to make sure they can reunify with their child.
Or if housing is a barrier to reunification, which is huge.
Or if housing is absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not just reunification. Think of older youth with goals around independence and aging out. In order to achieve that case plan, many of them may have legal needs like public benefits or educational needs, special education needs, vocational planning needs, or expungement of records, different things that can help set them up for success as they go into adulthood. So for this piece, it's both candidates and post-removal, children, parents, and kin as well. The only specific things that are really not included are criminal defense work. This is civil legal aid, not criminal, and immigration work is not covered either.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the Imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code podcast10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code podcast10 today.
Okay, third part here. What is being done to engage with states and various child welfare agencies about this? I know, Allison works for the National Association of Counsel for Children. There's all kinds of national and regional organizations that have a very keen interest and have been focused on this. ABA for one, you guys, Children's Rights, all kinds of organizations. So, feel free to speak from a coalition standpoint or from an ACC standpoint, but what is give people a sense of what is the work being done now that this rule is final to make use of it, get people to make use of it?
Sure. So first and foremost, this is going to take time. And we've been working on the Child Welfare Policy Manual change since 2019, and we're going to continue a push. What this really opens the door to is a new re-energized push. And like I said earlier, hopefully some new participation from states who were reticent to participate before. So what's happening? A few things. First, webinars, public education. There will be a webinar in July, a partnership between HHS and the Department of Justice, led by the Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable, that will focus on various sources of federal funding, but will highlight this one in particular to try to announce it to the field. Of course, a lot of technical assistance opportunities. And, we're also just seeing this opportunity threaded more and more through different Children's Bureau guidance, through their CFSR review processes, requiring more collaboration between states, court improvement programs, and their agencies. So we're seeing it referenced and brought up more, which is a really good thing because it creates opportunity for these conversations.
Last part, and an important one. How will we know if this rule had an impact, in your opinion, in 5-10 years? Take whatever window you feel is reasonable here, but what would you consider the evidence of success here? I guess the obvious answer is are there more kids and parents with lawyers? But that seems like we're kind of getting there already. what would you say is like a true, like, what are the metrics you guys plan to see?
Yeah. If all this rule does is produce more lawyers, that would not be sufficient to make it. And I think we're going to far exceed that,
Yeah.
because it's not just about giving a lawyer in name to every child parent. It's about giving a high quality lawyer and an opportunity for fair access to the courts, justice in these proceedings. So a few outcomes that I'm going to be looking at tracking. Number one, especially on that civil legal aid preventative opportunity, on reducing the number of kids who come into care. The notice of proposed rulemaking and the finalized rule cites to a host of evidence showing that when parents are assigned legal counsel at the preventative stages, it mitigates the need for foster care. The most frequently cited study in the proposed rulemaking was the Detroit Center for Family Advocacy. And, it was a smaller evaluation of 55 families, 110 children. 0 of those children had to enter foster care. And other kind of similar projects have showed similarly promising results. There was a project in Vermont where they were able to eliminate the need for foster care for 78% of the children served. So, number one, I'm going to be looking at, are less kids coming into care? And hopefully they will be. And I expect that they will be, because of the promise of pre-petition preventative legal services. From there, if children do come into care, this funding is still available afterwards. We really want to be looking at quality. It's important, it's critical that if states are drawing down this federal money, that they use it to supplement and not supplant their state funding. So let me just unpack a little bit what that means. What it means is we don't want states to say, hey, new opportunity for federal funding. We were already producing some money for attorneys, so let's draw down this federal money and take away what we were already plugging
Right.
in and divert it to another program, resource, or area of state need. We want it to supplement, because all of the great research around child and parent legal representation is about high quality legal representation, and we're not going to see the outcomes that we can reasonably expect unless we invest in that. So how have we seen states use this money, and how do we want to see them use it? Number one, lowering caseloads, having reasonable caseloads for attorneys, for children's attorneys, for example. NACC recommends caseloads of a case range between 40 and no more than 60 per attorney. And that's individual clients. That's not a sibling set of, if a sibling set has 5 kids in it, that's 5 clients right there. And 60 is substantially lower than what a lot of jurisdictions are doing now. But that is the caseload that 40 to 60 is needed to give attorneys adequate time to get to know their clients, to talk to them, to investigate the case independently, to not just rely on what other parties to the case are telling them, and to do really robust in and out of court advocacy. Where I think we will hopefully also see improvements in advocacy, because that funding can be used to bring in experts to help advise you on your case or to testify in your case. It can be used to enhance your team. So having what we call multidisciplinary models of legal representation, where attorneys are assisted by in-house social workers and peer partners, either parents or youth with lived experience in the system, to kind of create a model where the client has not just one, but 3 different disciplines that are interacting with them and helping navigate the system alongside them. So we're going to see better models of legal representation. And then lastly, I think overall, what I would love to see is higher reports of satisfaction with attorney performance from parents, children, kin, tribes. That's really important. The attorneys are important, not just for the outcomes they create, and they do create those outcomes, right? When attorneys are assigned, cases move generally 40% faster, and the kids are more likely to be placed with kin and have better school stability. But even if all of those things don't happen, there's an element of procedural justice, that even if a client doesn't get what they want from the judge, if they felt heard in the process, if they felt respected, they are more likely to accept the outcome of that case. And so hopefully we're going to see better experiences with the court system. We know that some children and parents have had awesome attorneys who are doing phenomenal work in the field. And we know there's been lackluster performance by some. And that's where our call is. That's where our charge is, to make sure that this funding goes to ensure quality for everyone, and that children and parents get due process and access to a high quality attorney.
It's certainly very possible and even likely that as, a long tail effect of this rule, you would see an impact on reductions of youth entering foster care. That would have some correlation, right? It seems to me like the most possible thing you'd start to see in data first might be an improvement in, or improvement's like a subjective word. You would see an increase in reunifications in a shorter amount of time, if that makes sense, right? Because like the one thing that there's got to be work done in along the way, along with this new opportunity for funding, is like child welfare systems are pretty used to assigning counsel at the point like foster care is already like gonna happen. And so like there's gonna have to be some work to kind of move that backwards towards earlier points in the case. But the research on really quality counsel for kids, really quality counsel for parents already shows that, it has a pretty dramatic effect on how long a kid's in foster care and if they come home. So I do feel like, maybe even a 5-year window. I hope so, because we've seen both of those kind of go in the wrong direction. If you look at the AFCARS data, the reunification rate nationally went under 50%. I think in 2017, it hasn't gone anywhere close. It's at like 47% now. The average time in care has kind of ticked up. So here's hoping that this could have an impact.
I'm hopeful that is what we will see, is shorter stays in care. And John, not just shorter stays in care, but shorter stays in care without repeat maltreatment. That's the key.
Yes, of course.
Right?
Yeah.
Is that we don't want kids, and that's a fear we see a lot when we do legislation on the state level. People unfamiliar with the field will say, well, wait, if parents get attorneys, if children get attorneys, won't safety be hidden from us? And then kids are just there's just like fear that that if children are unified more swiftly, that they'll be unsafe. And that's not the case, because attorneys can help when they're adequately trained and doing their job well, will help address those underlying issues so that kids can go home more quickly and those reunifications stick safely.
All right, Allison Green of the National Association of Counsel for Children, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you, John.
Thanks to Allison Green, Legal Director for the National Association of Counsel for Children, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.